weeks ago, the dust was barely settling on the surprising, new, bloody and violent conflict in the Middle East, the sudden war between Israel and Iran. In our episode that week, we got the immediate reaction from two analysts, Nahid Siamdoust and Ori Goldberg, while the missiles had barely stopped falling. This week, I wanted to look again at one of the players in that brutal war. Because for all the media attention Iran seems to occupy, I often feel like there's a bit of a black hole when it comes to what we hear from inside Iran and what we consequently understand about the country as a result. And that's a big problem, because Iran is such a consequential player in the Middle East and even on the global stage. The Islamic Republic is by no means afraid to flex its muscles in the region, so it affects millions of people in the Middle East. And that flexing of muscles is designed to do one thing: change the balance of power with the country Iran sees as its principal adversary, the United States. After the recent war, I wanted to explore why this black hole exists and what we should consider when it comes to what Tehran really wants. I brought onto the podcast Afshon Ostovar. Afshon is an associate professor at the US Naval Postgraduate School, and he's also written two very interesting and compelling books about Iran. Wars of Ambition, his latest, which considers that rivalry between the US and Iran, and Vanguard of the Imam, which explores the ideological underpinnings of the ruling regime in Tehran. It's a fascinating discussion. We don't agree on every point, but Afshon brought really compelling insights as well as a moving personal perspective. Stick around to the end of the episode to hear that. I'm Faisal Al Yafai. Here's this week's episode of The Lead. Afshon Ostovar, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
I wanted to start with a kind of meta question. You might have seen that the US journalist Tucker Carlson brought the Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian onto his channel, which I thought was interesting, quite apart from the context of the interview. Because while we might know, like, more or less the opposing positions of Zelensky and Putin in the Russian war, I feel like there's a real black spot in terms of what we hear from Iran and therefore what we can understand about the country itself.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, it's also a bit of a challenge when you talk about Iran, because depending on who's speaking for Iran and what's being amplified by Iranian officials, you often get sort of two different pictures, right? And one of them is from sort of the savvy, let's say, those officials that are familiar with the West and Western discourse and language and sometimes speak English, like Araqchi or
Mohammad
Javad Zarif or whatever. Javad Zarif is a fantastic example. I mean, he can speak in the American idiom. He knows how to speak to Americans. He knows the audience very well. So he can speak in a way that Iranian officials tend not to speak. He can still carry the water for Iranian positions. He can still put forward the same basic policies, but he can explain in a very different way. And Pezeshkian is not quite as savvy, but he can still sort of speak in a way that can put sort of, I would say, neutral observers, people that really have no stake in the relationship with Iran. He can make those people feel at ease, right? Because the Iranians are very good when they want to make their policies seem totally reasonable. And one of the ways they do that is just by lying and pretending that they have different policies. But another way to do that is just to speak to those issues that they know that there might be some support within the West for, right? So like things about Israel or things about U.S. wars in the Middle East or whatever, right? They know these things are unpopular. They know that a lot of Americans don't support some of these things. And so they can speak to it, I think, pretty effortlessly and make their position seem, quite fine and uncontroversial.
But isn't that what all these foreign politicians do? I wonder sometimes why we treat the Iranians as if they are something, like they're an inscrutable enigma that no one can possibly understand. Like, in some ways, they're just they're a normal country. There's a chain of command. They have people communicate. Khamenei's on Twitter.
Yeah, I think in terms of the way that they handle diplomacy, at least in terms of sort of televised interviews, they are a totally normal country. They know how to play politics. They're not naive in any way. They're certainly not inscrutable, and the regime isn't that, let's say, closed off, right? It's not North Korea or Turkmenistan
Right.
or something like that.
Exactly.
So yeah, so I think it gets to the point that you brought up earlier, is that it's just that Iranian voices aren't amplified that much. And a lot of that is sort of Iran's choice in the way it handles itself internationally. I mean, I think the way that they choose to present themselves doesn't do them any favors. They like to pretend that they are a much bigger deal than they are. They like to pretend that they carry much more weight than they do. And when they show up in international context, they like to sort of present themselves in a way that is kind of peacocking, right? And I say this not as Iran should be a humble country or a small country or a weak country and sort of placate bigger powers, but I just mean that it can sometimes be off-putting. For example, like, I don't know, several years ago when there was an official delegation to France and they boycotted the state dinner because they were serving wine. They sort of are always trying to emphasize their politics and ideology in a way that I think is just not really helpful in terms of getting business done, but also just not very attractive to foreign audiences.
And why do you think they do that? That's a good example, actually, isn't it? Because it kind of shows that they could just have ignored it. No one is forcing them to drink the wine. They can just ignore it, but they chose to make it an issue. What do you interpret from that?
Well, to me, it's about insecurity. Whenever they get an opportunity to sort of present themselves in the way that they want to be seen, they do it, right? They are never comfortable in just going along with things. They're never comfortable with playing, I don't know, the game as it's supposed to be played, or just being polite and diplomatic in the way that you're supposed to be polite and diplomatic. They always are trying to speak truth to power, right? In this very sort of graduate student kind of way.
I want to get to the Middle East as the battleground, but first I wanted to go back to this part about the way that the discourse over Iran is framed. And you have said that it tends to be dominated by these two groups that are part of the opposing sides of the conversation: the diaspora of Iran, which often doesn't have a very strong link to Iran as it is today, and then pro-Israeli commentators. And I think you feel that has done something to the way that the conversation is structured and heard in the West.
Yeah, I mean, listen, the only reason why Iran matters in U.S. foreign policy, let's say, or U.S. politics even, is because of the regime's stance towards Israel, right? And the only reason that Iran mattered in U.S. foreign policy or U.S. politics prior to 1979 was the regime's stance against the Soviet Union, right? So in this relationship that the U.S. has with Iran, Iran has never mattered in and of itself. Iran has only mattered as an ally or as an adversary. But as an ally against, the Soviet Union, or an adversary against an ally in Israel, right? So what I think Iranians find, or the Iranian diaspora find difficult to appreciate, is how little Iran actually matters in Washington. It matters at the moment, and it matters at different moments, but by and large, it doesn't drive politics, right? There are very few, if any, voters in America that are voting for Democrats or Republicans based on what the expected policy towards Iran will be, right? Whereas you do have voters that will vote based on policy towards Israel or something else.
But Afshon, that is the exception. I mean, if you talk about other countries as well, like you say, Iran doesn't matter to the United States. That's true. Iraq doesn't matter to the United States, particularly. Pakistan doesn't particularly matter. I mean, none of these countries, Namibia, Botswana, all these countries, what matters to the United States is the interests of the United States. And so in that situation, in that structure, actually, Israel is the exception, because there is this constituency of voters that care very much about this foreign country. That's not the case with the majority of other countries, foreign countries.
Right. But I think the difference here, right, is that, while it's true Namibia doesn't matter as much to U.S. foreign policy, or even Pakistan, is that they don't take up as much oxygen within foreign policy debates as Iran does, right? Iran is number 3 on the U.S. adversary list, right? And really number 1 in terms of sort of active engagement.
Right. Number 1s and 2 are China and Russia.
China and Russia,
Yeah.
right? But we're not bombing China and Russia. We have bombed Iran, right?
Right, right. The Iranians would say the reason you haven't bombed China and Iran, or the US hasn't, is because they both have nuclear weapons. So.
Well, that's part of it. The other part of it is they have really big militaries and, can defend themselves. I mean, but they're also, I would suggest, smart enough to not pick that fight.
And the thing about China and Russia is that they are very large global powers. And, you're right to point out that the number 3 on that list, Iran, it's a regional power at best. So it's very unusual that it takes up so much oxygen around DC.
Yeah. I mean, that's exactly right. And then if the Islamic Republic has done one thing, it's made themselves really important to U.S. foreign policy, at least in the sense that every conversation about U.S. foreign policy globally or just in terms of the Middle East always involves a discussion about Iran, right? So
but
they've got noticed, right? They're very good at that, sort of attracting that negative attention.
But part of the reason for that, and I thought this was a good framing for the wider conversation we're having, is that really, when you think about the recent war between Israel and Iran, you can see it as a tussle, a kind of a violent tussle, but a tussle nonetheless. But you say, this is in your most recent book, Wars of Ambition, that it is much more significant than that you have to look at it in terms of a longer conflict between Iran and the US, reinforced by the key ally Israel. The quote from your book is, "The struggle for the Middle East has been a microcosm of the larger geopolitical battle between those aiming to preserve the American-led global order and those seeking to overturn it."
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's true. In Iran, you can say, is a regional power, right? Or a regional actor, in the sense that it is what it strives to do mostly impacts what is going on around it, right? Iraq, Lebanon, Israel, whatever. But from Iran's perspective, or from the perspective of the Islamic Republic, what it's trying to do is laying the groundwork for a different world order, right? This is what they've been trying to do since 1979. And if you go back to 2023 and look at it from their perspective, so let's say October 6th, 2023, even October 7th, they were making quite a lot of progress, right? If you only look at the superficial sort of success that Iran had, they had immense influence in Iraq, immense influence in Syria, immense influence in Lebanon and Yemen, immense influence in Gaza, right? They have their main adversary kind of surrounded in terms of they have got missiles and rockets positioned all around it. They're able to do all of this in a way that's almost entirely unchecked, right? Israel's bombing Iranian positions in Syria all the time, but it's not stopping Iran progress. The United States isn't really doing anything. Iran hasn't been bombed or attacked directly through any of this, right? Meanwhile, they're getting closer to Russia. They're getting closer to China. They're trying to make progress in Latin America. They're cutting deals with the Venezuelans. All of this speaks to their ambition and what they're trying to achieve, right? You can weigh what they actually achieved against what they thought they were achieving and say, well, okay, it's not that important. But in terms of what they're trying to do, it's very much in alignment with China's trying to do and what Russia's trying to do. They're all acting in their own self-interest, but they're also acting in a way that strives to undermine what they see as the U.S.-led global order.
Right. And actually, some of those countries have been very explicit about it, that they want to bring about a multipolar world.
Right. And Iran has been just as explicit as the Chinese and Russians, right? So, no country in the world, aside from, let's say, China, and you can say Russia too, but I would say that Iran is more active than Russia in this regard. No country in the world has put more effort, more resources proportional to what they have towards making this happen, right? If you look at China, China's trying to sort of change things, but it's also pragmatic. It has to run business, it has to have a good economy, it has to sort of improve the lives of its citizens. Russia also is sensitive to its economy, which of course has changed with the war in Ukraine, but still it's sensitive to that. Iran has been much less sensitive to those issues, right? And has devoted a lot more to advancing its foreign policy interests than I think just about any other country in the world, right? So to me, that's what makes Iran really significant. It's much more active, much more devoted to what it's trying to do than I think just about any other country.
But Afshon, you spoke of Iran as trying to surround its adversary Israel. Mm-hmm. If the explanation that we put forward at the beginning of the Middle East as this battleground for the US, Iran, the Americans are also surrounding the Iranians. This battle for what order will prevail in the Middle East is not being waged solely on one side. Like the Iranians are not just the spoilers of it. The Americans are trying to do the same thing. They're trying to wage their own version of that.
Well, yes, that's true. And my thesis in the book is about those contending ambitions within the Middle East, right? Of trying to sort of make the Middle East something different. But I would say that the steam in American foreign policy in the Middle East really left the this is a terrible metaphor. I was going to say left the engine. This is a 19th century metaphor. But anyway,
exactly.
Yeah. Anyway, the influence or the motivation for the United States to sort of really do anything meaningful in the Middle East, besides, let's say, the Abraham Accords, really went out with the Iraq War, right? By the end of 2011, the U.S. was exhausted in the Middle East, and no administration since has really wanted to return to the Middle East in the same way, right?
Absolutely. And this is why the return of the bombing of the Americans bombing another country beginning with IRA is really strange, because it felt like the US under Trump was on this trajectory of America first, leaving the Middle East to its own devices, and now it doesn't look like we are in that space again.
Yeah, it depends on how you want to look at it, right? If let's say bombing Iran solves the nuclear issue, I'm not saying it does, but let's just say that's your position, then the U.S. has a lot less to do in the Middle East. If it doesn't solve the nuclear issue and rather just sort of ensnares the U.S. in a longer, protracted conflict with Iran that's intermittent and includes bombing Iran more often, in the years to come, then of course it wasn't successful, right? So I think that the jury is still out on the outcome of the U.S. action in Iran. But I will say that,
is the jury still out? I mean, surely the fact that the regime still stands means that it is inevitably going to seek to return to its old mechanisms of control. Whether that control is continuing the proxy wars or seeking to rush for a nuclear bomb, but whatever it is going to continue to oppose the US-led order.
Well, yes, but I think from a much weaker position and with just about no deterrence or leverage left, right? So it's one thing to have an adversary that is empowered, right? It's another thing to have an adversary who's disempowered. But in both cases, Afshon, you are still putting a lot of time and effort and money and resources into thinking about that adversary. So if you think about it in the outline you just explained, it's not as if Iran has now, post the bombing, dropped off number 3 on DC's list. It's still there. It is there. It is still there, but it has a lot less with which to threaten sort of U.S. allies, right? So I don't want to say it's defanged, but it has certainly been injured, right? So had the goal been regime change, then it's a failure, right? But if it had been to forestall or destroy the nuclear program, then I think, the jury's still out in terms of where they go. Because, yes, let's say Iran still possesses all of its stockpile. Let's say it still possesses some ability to enrich in hidden facilities or even in Fordo, whether now or 3 months from now or whatever. It could try to develop a nuclear weapon, right? It would have to have a test, and then it would have to either deal with the ambiguity or declare its nuclear weaponization. But if you're Iran, if you're the Islamic Republic, and you have just suffered one of the most humiliating operations, right? Where almost all of your top commanders were assassinated, no matter where they were, safe houses, at their house, under bunkers. Israel was producing drones inside the country that Iranians were making, that it used to destroy Iran's air defenses before Iran even had a chance to use those air defenses, right? Iran is so thoroughly penetrated by Israeli intelligence. There's no way that the Islamic Republic could be confident that if they developed a nuclear weapon, that one, they could do it in secret, meaning that, while they're trying to do it, they haven't sort of triggered more attacks, right? And that once they do it, that they could actually protect that stockpile, right? Because it's one thing for Israel or the US to bomb an underground facility that's enriching uranium. It's another thing to bomb a facility that has a nuclear weapon or 2 nuclear weapons or 3 nuclear weapons, right? And there's no reason for the Islamic Republic to feel that a nuclear weapon would somehow magically make it safe, right? And the risk of trying to produce that weapon is really, really high. So,
but what is the risk? The Iranians, by some assessments, by most assessments, were not seeking to produce this weapon. The Israelis claimed they were and bombed them anyway. So
yeah.
What difference does it make? You may as well try to produce the weapon since you're going to be accused of doing so anyway.
Yeah, I mean, nobody serious doesn't think that the Iranians were not trying to produce. We're not trying to develop the means to make a weapon.
Yeah,
right,
exactly.
To have the ability to make the weapon.
Yeah,
right?
I'm not suggesting that they were genuinely not trying to learn that process, but I'm suggesting that it's not as if the Israelis have to wait until they are genuinely doing it to claim that they are doing it. So why not just go ahead?
But I mean, Iran has spent decades sort of genuinely doing it. There is absolutely no reason for Iran to have enriched uranium to 60%, like zero, unless it wanted to weaponize. There's no utility whatsoever. And the cost of enriching to that level is, of course, sanctions. It led to a war, right? Like, those are serious costs. And those are costs that are absorbed for perhaps no reason, right? If Iran really didn't want to produce a nuclear weapon. But if Iran did want to produce a nuclear weapon, then they were a risk, perhaps worth taking. But the risk failed. If Iran wanted to break out now and make another nuclear weapon, it risks further war, right? It risks a longer, more protracted conflict with Israel. And there's a reason why the war ended. I mean, there's a reason why Iran wanted an off-ramp in the conflict, and that's because it was sustaining too much damage, right? It was already depleting its missiles. It has no other way to fight back, and it has no way to protect its skies, right? And if you can't protect your skies and you can't really hit back, then you're just taking punches, right? And at some point, those punches could start to risk regime security or regime stability, right?
But I guess what I've been trying to work out since the conflict ended is I've been trying to work out what would be the logic of the Iranians not getting a bomb. Because the lesson of the last 20 years has been that every country that has given up a nuclear weapon has been attacked. Iraq, Libya, Ukraine, now Iran. North Korea, still fine. Pakistan, India, all good. So surely the message that is received is we may as well do this as quickly as we can. Plus, the example that you've just offered of all of these sunk costs of years of sanctions and all of that pain and lack of development, you may as well keep going, right?
I think from an emotional level, absolutely, right? From an emotional level, it's clear cut. If you're the Islamic Republic, we should have made the bomb 20 years ago. We shouldn't have just messed around and dragged it out and whatever. We should have just done it
as fast as possible. And yeah. Right, okay.
But hindsight's 2020, right? They've crossed the Rubicon. They've already triggered the conflict. What I'm suggesting is that they can, let's say, produce a nuclear weapon, but they would have no way to protect themselves and no way to protect their nuclear stockpile, right? And that leaves them much more vulnerable than they were before. Because now you're talking about, nuclear weapons could explode in Iran, right? And those nuclear weapons could be Iranian weapons. And that's something that they have to take seriously. And this isn't just my thinking, right? You've had op-eds in Iranian hardline newspapers that have thought through this logic too, right? This is an actual conversation going on within the regime publicly. So it's something that they're certainly wrestling with, right? So there's no fait accompli here in terms of, well, okay, you blamed me for slacking off at work, so now I'm just going to slack off at work. They may feel like that, but actually doing it in this case would be a real significant risk for a lot of reasons. That's not to say that they won't do it. I think you've laid out the logic for why they could.
But there is an alternative logic. And certainly when you look at it from the perspective of regime stability, the regime feels very weak currently. And so it is unlikely to try to test those limits too much, at least for a couple of years.
I would think so. I'm always open to being surprised, right? Like, I think for those of us that follow the Middle East, humility should come with the territory of studying this place, right? There's always things that happen that you're like, well, I wouldn't have anticipated this.
Fawaz Gerges said that on our podcast a couple of weeks ago. It's just the same kind of thought that, yeah, absolutely, it's a kind of a graveyard of theories.
Yeah, I mean, you have to be humble about this, right? So they absolutely could, but I think the risks are too high for it to be an obvious decision or an easy decision. And to your point, I mean, the first order of business for any regime, any autocratic regime, right, whose authority does not come from the will of the people, right, is to protect itself. It's to safeguard itself. It's to stay in power, right? And Iran has always viewed, or the Islamic Republic has always viewed, Iranian society as the biggest danger to its existence, right? The existential threat doesn't come from Israel, the United States. It comes from the Iranian people. But Israel and the United States, from the regime's perspective, have the ability to sort of get things going, right? If a war happens or something like that, let
me ask you about that, actually, because you talk about being surprised. Were you surprised? We had the political analyst Nahid Siamdoust on the podcast a couple of weeks ago about this topic, and she said that I think the Israelis and maybe even the Iranian regime itself was surprised at how stable it turned out to be. There was no uprising of the people against it, and they are still firmly in control. Were you surprised by that?
No, not at all. Not at all. Because, I mean, listen, Iranians have rebelled against the regime a number of times. And every time, the regime's response has become worse, right? If you go back to the protests of 2018, right, in Mashhad in the south, for example. I mean, they were using machine guns and artillery and tanks to just kill Iranians. If you go back to the Women Life Freedom protests, they were doing just horrific things to the Iranians, right? And this is all recent memory. So the young people that rebelled a few years ago know what's in store if they rebel again. And I think even more than that, they know that the regime has been embarrassed. They know that the regime is like an abusive parent, right? And the regime just got fired or just was embarrassed by their boss. They know that they are going to come down hard on the Iranians and just need any excuse to do it. So I think if anything, the regime was probably more stable during the bombing and in the immediate aftermath than at any time before or whatever will happen in the future, just because Iranians know that the regime, the way that I say it is that Iran might lack the means to hit back effectively at its foreign adversaries, right? But it knows exactly how to hurt its own people, right? It hasn't lost that power.
Let's talk a bit about Iran in the wider region. You say in Wars of Ambition that, quote, Iran's campaign against Israel is the single most destabilizing conflict in the Middle East. And I wanted to probe that assertion from both sides of the coin, both sides of the rial, so to speak.
Yeah.
On the one side, the Iranian regime has been extraordinarily destabilizing across the Arab world. So in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Yemen, just killing and sectarianism and the slow unpicking of nation states. And this vision for the region is not a positive one. It's simply the idea of using Arab states as a shield to surround Israel, and that's hardly conducive to a progressive Middle East. But that has been the plan these past decades up until what you now call this inflection point, correct?
Yeah. Yes.
Right. And yet at the same time, what is the alternative to that? Because this US-led vision that counteracts that isn't a positive one either. We have the Israelis engaged in aggressively expansionist, this hawkish right-wing government, spoiling for a fight with Iran. Where in this is a positive vision, a vision that even like the people can get behind about how the Middle East can be reordered?
Well, I mean, that's a great question, right? But I would say that the actions of the Islamic Republic, right, over the last 46 years, but especially since 2003, have brought the rest of the region into Iran's own business, right?
Right, but I mean, you picked that date for a reason. Who made
No,
it
no, no,
happen?
no. I know. Listen, I'm not saying. If you read the book, I mean, I'm
I
very
did.
clear about how destabilizing the
No, I
Iraq War
did.
was, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the Iraq War kicks off,
Absolutely.
yeah, everything.
It kicks off this modern period of Iran using the Arab states as the shields.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, right? So the Iraq War creates this context in which Iran has a chance to sort of exploit. And the United States really did not consider Iran's response, didn't have a good way of managing Iran's response. And Iran, from my perspective, won the Iraq War. It had far more power in that country than the United States had. The United States still had a lot of power in that country when it left too, but Iran was definitely sort of the leader of the ground game, as I call it.
And Iran is right next door, and the US is
right
6,000 miles
right?
away.
It has a lot of advantage in that respect,
and
right?
to your point earlier about the way that the regime treats its own people, it also had much more power over its own people because it had the example of what might happen next door to frighten its public with.
Yeah. So if you compare, let's say, okay, what the Bush administration had hoped for the Middle East versus what Iran had hoped for the Middle East, in the broad strokes, what they both hoped for the Middle East was, an outcome that looked rosy, right? The U.S. wanted to create democracies. Democracies create freedom. Freedom creates, the theory went more reasonable acting states. What they had hoped is that you would have a Western-leaning Iraq that, was either nice to or at least indifferent to Israel, and the Middle East could move beyond sort of this post-1948 kind of Arab-Israeli conflict, right? And what Iran wanted
let me pause you there, Afshon, because,
Yeah.
I mean, you're very connected in D.C. Do you believe that that is what they wanted? I mean, certainly that is what they said they wanted, but I mean, really, does the theory stack up?
Listen, when we're talking about like the neocon theorists for this, that's absolutely what they wanted. I think they really believed
Middle
it.
East
And
of flourishing, stable, powerful democracies.
Well, powerful is another question.
Okay,
but stable.
But this is what I mean about it, is that sometimes it is framed as if, well, what we want is a flourishing Middle East. You don't want powerful states. Okay, so what do you want?
I don't think flourishing was in their theory, but certainly stable, and no longer hostile to Israel, right? But they didn't want to do that. But they didn't want to do that through authoritarianism, right? And this is the one thing that I think is hard to sort of appreciate about the neocons, is that they were, they really believed in this theory, right? That democracies created peace. Now, there's all sorts of other people involved in the Bush administration that I think had very different views of Iraq and wanted different things, right? But if you look at like the real neoconservative theorists, yeah, I do think that they, and if you look at like George W. Bush, for example, and read his stuff, I do think he was very sort of optimistic about about what could be achieved, right? There were certainly cynics and people that wanted very different things, but
optimistic in this context is a synonym for unaware, surely.
I mean, you can read into optimism however you want, right? But like, a doe-eyed optimist is somebody else's.
I lived through the Bush era. I mean, I remember the man on TV. I don't think you would think of him as a great theoretician of the region, but.
No, but he believed them, right?
Okay,
so if you
fair enough.
So if you read like his autobiography and whatever, like he seems to have really believed him in all of his interviews since, right? So, and Iran, of course, wanted the opposite, right? It wanted to create a context in which the Muslim world could finally sort of drive out the Zionist state from existence, right? Not kill all the Jews, not drive them into the sea, but create a Palestine in which you have one person, one vote, and you no longer have a Jewish state, right?
I would question whether they really believed that. It sounds like post the Arab Spring, we have seen what world the Iranians wanted to create, and it wasn't a world of flourishing Middle Eastern states. It was a world where they were destabilizing and sectarianism and.
Well, but But listen, there's a difference between what people say they want to achieve and what they believe they can achieve and how they go about achieving it, right? So when how you go about achieving these Xanadus, right? These perfect, peaceful societies, if the way that you go about it is through war and conflict, you're generally not going to get there, right? So the US is dropping big, massive bombs and occupying a country. It didn't lead to peace, right? Iran's method was to arm criminals and to create militias and to incentivize these militias to kill and maim and coerce.
Absolutely.
And this is where my argument for Iran's destabilizing foreign policy comes from, is that post-Iraq, once you get to the Arab Spring, Iran has this tried and true tactic, right, where it knows how to win conflicts against more powerful enemies. And the way that it does it is it creates this groundswell of militias that know how to keep things destabilized. That's how they win, right? They win by keeping states weak and by keeping geographies permissible to violence, right?
That was the lesson of the Iraq invasion. That was because they looked at what was happening in Iraq and they said the way we win this war, and because they were of course terrified that they would be next in that domino, the way to do that is to consistently destabilize the Americans, destabilize any Iraqi government. And it seems exactly. I mean, it worked.
No, it did work. It did work, right? But for Iran, victory is zero sum, right? For Iran, victory was the U.S. loses, right? Or Israel loses, or Saudi Arabia loses. Whomever they're opposing, so long as they cannot achieve their objective, they lose, right? So all Iran had to do to get victory was to prevent the other side from winning,
exactly, right?
And so Iran's not actually trying to create anything helpful. The Islamic group was just trying to make things so difficult that the other side couldn't win, right? And so what ends up happening is that you never have any side winning. You just have this sort of constant churn of violence and civil war in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen, right? Anywhere that Iran touches, the people that Iran empowers are just militants. They know how to kill, they know how to maim, they know how to coerce, but they have no idea how to lead. They have no idea how to put things back together.
Yeah, and you see that so clearly in Yemen and in Syria, both places where they have enormous amount of influence, and yet the vision of those two governments is not a vision that even their own publics can get behind.
Right, exactly. And so this is the basis of that thesis, right, is that Iran is, for all of what Iran is saying it wants to achieve, right, it is not actually achieving anything other than disorder, right? Violence and instability. You can agree with the Islamic Republic's politics. You can say, hey, I don't like Israel either. I support empowering anti-Israel groups. But when you look at the outcome of it, we can look at the outcome in Syria. We can look at the outcome in Gaza, right? Iran's support has not been helpful, I would say, for anybody.
Okay, I want to switch track a little bit because I want to talk about your previous book as well. Behind the specificities of what Iran is doing is an ideology, and this is an ideology that you dealt with in your previous book, which is called The Vanguard of the Imam, where you were considering the ideology of the regime, which you frame as a Khomeiniist Shia Islamism. And one of the reasons why I think that book is so interesting is that often when we think about the way that the Islamic Republic uses religion, we think of it as it's using it in the context of realpolitik. Like it has its own strategic aims, it wants power and regime survival, and the religion is a cloak to mask that. But you say in the book that that isn't the case, that the regime's rulers are actually true believers, and they believe that religion plays a central role in their decision-making. So I wondered if you could flesh that out for us a little bit.
Yeah, so when it comes to belief, right, anybody who's a believer, right, generally has a flexible faith, right? And so the difference between sort of a true believer and an agnostic, let's say, right, is that a true believer always convinces themselves that God is on their side and that they can get right with God if they do X, Y, and Z, right? But they always, can find ways to legitimize whatever they do if they're doing things that aren't great. in the Islamic Republic's experience, right, you have people that are very religious. They pray, they fast, they memorize the Quran, they memorize hadith, the traditions of the Prophet. They do all the things that religious people do. They speak to God, they pray, they hope, all those kinds of things, right? But when it comes to sort of politics doesn't always follow the morality of religion, at least not as such. And so they have to sort of find ways to legitimize what they do. And what I find is that ideology really matters in terms of identity. It really matters in terms of prioritization. Ideology doesn't matter that much when it comes to tactics, operations, and implementing policy, right? When you implement policy, morality goes out the window, religion goes out the window. You are just being pragmatic. You are just trying to figure out, how do I get from point A to point B? And then if you need to, you can sort of flesh out a religious roadmap of what took you there, but you're not drawing on religion first and foremost, right? Religion is just sort of, as you would say, the framing, the way that you sort of couch it. But when it comes to identity, when it comes to where they see themselves in terms of the world or the region, whatever, that to me is where ideology and religion really matter, right? And it matters at times more than others, right? So if we look at the Arab Spring, which quickly became sort of a sectarian sort of conflict in Syria and in Yemen in particular, or Bahrain, or even Iraq, right? So in all those contexts, right, it was very easy to use identity and religion to motivate action, to justify action. Same with Israel, right? Israel can be sort of couched in the same way. But when it comes to sort of domestic policies or dealing with unrest in the country or whatever, then religion becomes a little more flexible. Or when it comes to sort of dealing with China or Venezuela or Cuba or whomever, then religion really doesn't matter at all. So it matters just like in any way that identity matters to people, right? Like the way that I always sort of describe it is when I'm lecturing in front of a classroom, like I'm an educator, right? When I'm in a car, I'm an impatient driver. When I'm at home, I'm a very humbled, very secondary sort of person. Our identities sort of matter differently in context, right? And it's the same, I think, for the identity and the ideology for the Islamic Republic. It really matters at certain times, and it doesn't matter at other times. But it's always used to legitimize and to frame what the Islamic Republic is all about and what it does.
Interesting. I wanted to end with something completely different. I heard you once say that what drew you to study Iran in the first place was an attempt to have some kind of relationship with the country. Your family were originally Iranian and they left before the revolution. And I thought about this, and I thought how much of the field of Middle East studies in the West is shaped by people who have been denied some kind of link to these countries because of the endless wars. Like, it's almost as if the inability to have an emotional connection to the country, because you can't go there for the summers, leads to a kind of more intellectual link. I wonder how far you'll come with me on that theory.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, I'm always a little sensitive to this, right? Because for people who do area studies that are not their area, right?
Yeah.
Then it's always a little kind of quaint and pathetic, that you're sort of like, oh, you want to study your mom's country, or you want to pretend that you're less second generation and more first generation, or there's always this sort of like sense of, I don't know.
You're saying that is
that you're sort of like trying to make up for shortcomings.
You're trying to compensate
like
for that, but you're saying that is something that people in area studies where they don't have this link to the region they're studying, that is something that they say.
You get a whiff of that, certainly.
Okay, so
like if
it's almost like a moral thing that I wanted to study Iran. I have nothing to do with Iran, but I wanted to study it because I'm intellectually curious. You want to study it because you can't go back since Granddad left.
Yeah,
exactly.
Kind of thing, right. That kind of thing.
Okay.
So for me, it was. I didn't actually go into any of this to study Iran, right? Like, so before I started college, I went and lived across the Middle East and Central Asia for a couple years, and just volunteered as an English teacher and did random things. It was basically like a backpacker back in the days when you could do that.
But you've talked about this. I mean, I think I see your hesitation now. The hesitation is but you had a genuinely, like, you had a real intellectual curiosity about Shiaism and about so it isn't just the family aspect. It's
no, not at all. And so this is sort of where I'm getting to this, right? So, I mean, there's a reason why I was backpacking across the Middle East, right? I mean, it was certainly to sort of connect with something that had been more abstract sort of growing up. But when I came back, intellectually, I was interested in all sorts of things, but mostly security and Islamism. I didn't even know it as Islamism at the time. This is all sort of pre 9/11. And my professors took an interest in me and they got me to study things. And they kept saying, well, if you want to understand that, you got to understand what came before it, right? And so the next thing I know, I'm studying medieval Persianate literature and studying slavery and all these kinds of interesting things. But my interest in Iran was always very personal, right? So I didn't want to study it because of that, right? Like, you know, the way that I sort of talk about is when you study something that's really personal in an intellectual way, it's kind of like studying your mom, right? Like imagine writing a biography of your mom or something like that. Like you generally don't want to know some things. There's a magic to the mystery some ways, and that's nice. And once you start sort of unpacking all of it, I don't know, it loses a little bit of magic. To me, that's the risk, right? So, like, for example, when I was a teenager, I had a friend, we all played guitar, and he was really into the Smiths. And I said, have you learned how to play any Smith songs? He's like, well, I could, but once you learn them, it just kind of ruins the magic of them, you know? And that really stuck with me. That was like a profound thing, you know, for my teenage mind to sort of grasp. And I feel like I encountered that a bit with studying Iran. And so there's the things that I would have wanted to write books about or study are things that wouldn't have got me a job, you know, things that never would have like been even like hireable, right? Like I was really interested in food and Mazandarani language and all these kinds of sort of things that were personal. And so I think there's a reason why I sort of gravitated towards the security aspect or the politics aspect or the ideology aspect is these are things that didn't touch my family at all in a sense.
You maintain some of the magic. This is really interesting. I'm glad I asked you this question. It was meant to be a kind of throwaway question, but I actually, it's related to something else that we were talking about this week with the podcast producer, because we were going to talk to a memoirist this week, a memoirist who's written about the Middle East. And one of the things that I thought was interesting about memoir is that we so rarely hear from the experiences of the generation that you are talking about, your mother's generation, your father's generation. We don't really know what their lives were like. And part of I mean, there's all sorts of reasons why publishers aren't interested in those stories. But even today, I think we don't have much of an idea of what that world was like. You'll have seen this meme, which one of our colleagues on the team is endlessly fond of posting about, and how it's taken off, you know, about this was Iran before the Iranian revolution, right? We don't actually know very much about what people's lives were like at that period of time.
Yeah, you know, it's funny because when you talk to people about it, right? Like it is always framed in the sense of what has been lost.
Yeah, it's the lost world, the Jurassic Park thing. Yeah. It's this amazing world that could have been.
But the way that I always sort of put it is, there's a reason why my family ended up in the United States.
I was about to say, I mean, you are an excellent example of this, right? Your family left before the revolution. There's a reason they left before the revolution and not after.
They left with high aspirations. I mean, it was kind of funny. It was my grandfather, who was basically dying, told my uncle, the eldest of his children, take the girls to the United States. I don't want them to grow up here. There's not a good future for them here. And so that's what my uncle had to do, right? And so, you know, a year after my grandfather died, he took my mom, he took my aunt, and he came to the United States, and they didn't really have a choice.
I don't know what to make of that, because I think what it does, of course, is it gives the lie to the idea that there was this bright, glistening future and 1979 came along and destroyed it. But equally, it also suggests that, I suppose what it really suggests is that, like every country in the world, they were trying to develop as best they could and trying to figure out a path through. I mean, I'm being a little bit facile about that particular period. There's a reason why people remember the period of the Shah as being full of repression and savak and things like this. But in any case, there were things about that country that meant that people who were living there wanted to leave and go elsewhere.
Yeah. I mean, I think it was just a sense of more opportunity. They didn't have a bad life in Iran. Things were good. My uncle, who had to leave, was really enjoying himself in Iran, had a great life.
Yeah.
So he wasn't planning on leaving, but he did it because that's what his father sort of asked him to do.
And
so
you're not curious about like that? Just to circle back to it, because you said earlier that you didn't want to investigate too much about Iran because it's like, reading the memoir of your mother, and you're kind of you don't want to get into it too much. But don't you? I mean, isn't it fascinating to know a little bit about what that world was like beyond?
No, absolutely, no, it really is. My point is that you don't want to do it as a profession, right? You don't want it to be your profession. It's certainly that you're endlessly fascinated with on a personal level, and I'm translating my grandmother's memoir, for example, and it's fascinating, and the experiences that she had were just, she helped raise me as a kid, but she died when I was still, young, just 8 years old or whatever. And so I don't remember these stories that she told. So it's a way of sort of learning those things, but it's also like, it's endlessly fascinating. And I think the saddest part about it, right, is that we don't have the ability, at least I don't personally have the ability, to sort of go back and trace those footsteps, to have an experience, to see this village or this neighborhood, or, in some respects, the graveyards for my ancestors don't even exist anymore, so there's a melancholy to it too, in terms of what you've lost. And I think there's a difficulty there, right? But yeah, in terms of professional, like in terms of what you devote your time to, like, yeah, it's not something you want to sort of live with. It's something that you want to do for joy and interest, but not something that you just want to sort of slave over, right? Because at the end of the day, I think what you do professionally, no matter how much you sort of love it, it ends up being work, and you end up being tired of it. And I don't know about you, but like, I love the Middle East. I love Iran. I love all of this stuff, but I also kind of hate it. Right. It's miserable, to write and read about this stuff all the time. There's very little joy coming out of this part of the world, at least in terms of the way that I have to interact with it, right? So
that's the part, right?
I think the greatest irony for me is that I wanted to have this relationship that would have been sort of a positive, affirming one, right? And you end up sort of writing about things that are not what you want to be thinking about, right? This is very much not the relationship with Iran that I sort of anticipated having, but it's enriching in its own way, I suppose.
Do you ever feel, I sometimes think about future generations who will get to interact with the Middle East in a much calmer way. They'll get to interact in the way that Western Europeans can interact with their heritage and go, oh, my mother was Italian, actually. I went to Italy. Like this. And I sometimes think, I wonder what it'll be like for them. Do you ever think about that, about the future Afshons?
I do. I always say that, we talked about optimists before. I'm an absolute optimist over the long term. I really feel that at some point, maybe not in my lifetime, but at some point, this part of the world will not be what it is today. And people will be happy, countries will be stable, things will be okay, and people will get that experience. I hope it for my kids, if not for me, that you can sort of go back and experience that. But it's difficult to sort of, I think, imagine it right now. It's hard to sort of see where that goes. And not just because the Middle East is a challenge, but the whole world is kind of a challenge. And it's hard to see where humanity turns correct. But you certainly hope for it.
Afshon Ostovar, thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
You've been listening to The Lead from New Lines magazine. Afshon Ostovar's books, Wars of Ambition and Vanguard of the Imam, are available to buy now online and in all good bookstores. He also has a new podcast hosted by War on the Rocks called The Iran Reckoning. This week's episode was produced by Finbar Anderson and hosted by me, Faisal Al Yafai. For more like this, subscribe to The Lead on your favorite podcast app or visit our website, newlinesmag.com.